Well, I'm going to talk about the report of the expert panel on women's research careers. And so let me give you a little bit of background before the slides appear. So how did this study come about? I was the chair of this expert panel. In 2008, many of you will recall that the Government of Canada announced the Canada Excellent Research Chair, which is a new type of Canada Research Chair, which was intended to attract international experts, either Canadians who were working abroad to come back to our universities or international scholars to come to our universities. And when the results of the competition were announced, there were 19 CERCs, and they were all men. And so there was great outrage. Thank you very much. That's absolutely perfect. There was great outrage about all of this. The Minister of Industry appointed an ad hoc committee on why this had happened, led by Elizabeth Dowdeswell, and it reported in 2010. It was a preliminary report, and in 2010, the Minister of Industry, not the minister, but the ministry, the officials for whom I have the most enormous respect, said, well, we don't know enough. We have to find out more about why it is that there were no women in that competition. And so they asked the Council of Canadian Academies to investigate. And the Council of Canadian Academies, for those of you who don't know it, is an independent, not-for-profit organization, which, by the way, has a quite significant research staff with absolutely wonderful jobs in research. It's in Ottawa. Helps if you're bilingual. People from all kinds of fields. So it supports independent, science-based expert assessments to inform public policy development in Canada. It has a board of governors, a scientific advisory committee, etc. And the way it works is this. Government of any level, federal, provincial, municipal, can go to the council and say, can you give us the evidence on this question? The council reports make no recommendations. So there are no recommendations in our report at all, but we try to accumulate, with the help of the research team, all the facts we can find on the question. So here was the question put to us. What policies and what societal, cultural, and institutional, economic, relevant factors influence the career trajectory of women researchers in Canadian universities and underline gender disparities? And the panel was created. There were 15 people, international and national people on the panel, men and women. And before our report came out, it was read by 13 reviewers. All the names of them are in the report, and I think there are actually some here today. I urge you, if you're interested in the subject, to read the whole report. I have a few minutes. I'm just going to touch on some of what I think are the interesting highlights. First of all, since 1970, as Chris just said in talking about the earlier book, 1970 was really a turning point for the proportion of women in Canadian universities, in North American universities. So we showed the difference between 1970 and now. And we put the people who we're defining as researchers into three categories: life sciences, humanities, social sciences, and education, and physical science, computer science, engineering, and mathematics. Now, you will notice that that last category is not STEM. You cannot get data on Canada to put our scientists into what is internationally known as STEM. So we put them into the closest we could find, which we call PCEM. It's almost impossible to do comparative data with other countries from the Canadian data set. And the theme of my whole talk is the data are missing or in many cases inadequate, and we need something. We need to do something about it. So given that, here's a table from our report. And as you see, it shows the percentage of women by rank. It shows you there are about 34,000 people who are what we're defining as researchers. And of course, there is no definition of a researcher. So in order to use the available data, we're talking about people with a PhD who have a full-time position in a Canadian university that has more than 50 faculty. That's our definition of our population. And so there are about 34,000 such people. And as you can tell, about half of them are, well, not quite, about a third of them are women, and the other 2/3 are men. And this shows them by rank. So then we started looking at them by the 3 groups that we had established to see if we could find out what happened as they move up the ranks. And here you see the people in humanities, social sciences, and education. So we start out with a bachelor's degree, and you see that the proportion of women with bachelors who go on to masters and indeed PhDs rises, and then they get jobs as assistant professors, and then things really go badly. Between the PhD and the assistant professor, a lot of people go off into other fields. Some go to law, some go to industry, et cetera, et cetera. But look at the drop between associate and full professor. This is an extremely worrisome finding, and it seems to occur everywhere. There's something going on at the movement between associate and full. Now, we had kind of anticipated the drop between PhD and assistant. We even anticipated a bit of a drop between assistant and associate. But that fall off, we think, was quite significant. And there's a tail there which we can't really define. Now, here we are in life sciences. And you see the pattern is not dissimilar in the life sciences. Again, the higher the rank, the lower the proportion of women. But now, look at this. This is our PCEM. This is physics, maths, engineering, etc. It's a completely different and very interesting pattern. Very few start, more do masters, PhD, the drop-off occurs, but it doesn't cross. And of course, this speaks to the relatively small number of people in our country that go into these fields. And we're quite peculiar in this regard. We had somebody from the European Union on the panel who had the data for all the European countries. And this particular finding is, it may be North American, but it's certainly not the pattern in Europe, as many of you will know. And so one of our major questions in this study was, will this change over time? People say, well, just give it a few more years. But, you know, we've been going since the 1970s, so we've been through more than one generation. And should we be seeing this pattern over time? So we did something that is statistically a little dubious, but it was the best we could do. We created a synthetic cohort because you can't get any longitudinal data on any faculty member in any Canadian university. It's impossible. So this synthetic cohort, if you follow the dark numbers, you see the 1971 year of earned PhD. 9.3% of PhDs earned in 71 were earned by women. And then you see what happens to them when they're 30 to 39. They become assistant professors, and then more than 13% become associate professors in the 40 to 49 age group, and then it drops off to just under 10% for those 50 to 59. And then so the next cohort ought to do better, right? So the next cohort has double the number of people with women with PhDs, and then it drops instead of rising as assistant professor, and it rises a bit as associate professor, and then we're down to 15% for the 76 cohort. And so if you follow the patterns through, you'll see that there isn't really a lot of change over that period of time. The pattern remains. And we concluded in our own mind, though we make no recommendations, but our sense is that this will not change over time. Something else has to change. And the question is, what else has to change? I would argue, but this is my personal opinion and certainly not in the study, that universities have to really deeply consider the way in which they're organized. There are obviously barriers in the organizational structure. It's certainly not the women who are getting the degrees because we've had generations and et cetera. There were three major challenges in this study, which I would also urge you to think about. The first one is the data gaps. As I said, no longitudinal data, which is so important. Absolutely no data at all on postdocs in Canada. It's a huge investment in higher education, postdocs, and we don't track them, we don't know where they are, we don't know what they do, we don't know their gender, we know nothing unless in a particular institution. Data from government. We were asked to compare women in academic research with women in government research, but in fact, there is a category called research, but as soon as you advance, you become under some sort of management category, so you disappear as a researcher. So how would you know? So you can't get the data, and anyway, they weren't about to give it to us. And we were supposed to look at the private sector. So we actually set out, and I did quite a bit of interviewing in some firms that hire a lot of lab scientists, women. And it was very, very interesting, but then the firms refused to let us use the data, so we don't have the data in our report, but I learned a lot. And of course, there's no data available on the diversity issues. How many are Aboriginal, how many are people with disabilities, how many are members of minorities in the country? Gone. And as some of you will know who've been around for a while, there was something called the Federal Contractors Program, and all universities who did $200,000 worth of business with the feds had to report annually women, people with disabilities, Aboriginal, et cetera, and we all did, and it was all audited, and they've canceled the program last year, and they will not give access to the data. So we can't answer the question. The second big problem is coordination and standardization. Now, you may not believe this, but the tri-councils have totally different definitions. So you can't even, there are many, many researchers in this country who get grants from in health and in science or in humanities, and there are people with grants from all over the place, but you can't track them because they keep their records totally differently. And so the problems go on. We need people in science policy who actually know how to standardize and coordinate and have their eye on looking at outcomes data. And of course, lack of access. And I've talked about the inability to get the federal contractors program. So these were all very distressing. And if you go to the report, you'll see an amplification of what I've just been talking about, what we went after and what we were and were not able to do. One thing we did do, here's the URL for our report, which you can download. One of the things we did do was get a reanalysis of the interviews that had been conducted with CRCs, looking especially at the responses we'd had from women who are CRCs. And those data were extremely interesting. So you hear certain case studies. For example, somebody who said she'd gone on maternity leave and the university had refused to allow her to keep her lab open because they didn't put anybody else in charge of her lab, and her grad students went off and got other jobs and so on. But in the very same term in which she was going off on maternity leave, one of her male colleagues had a heart attack and left, and they immediately put in somebody else to run his lab, and he was able to keep his work going. So there are all kinds of individual accounts of things that have happened that would make some of us conclude that we need to look at just how things are organized in universities as workplaces. And before we start examining in depth the behavior of the men and women, we need to look at the organization of the workplace because it works differently elsewhere. In this private sector organization where I interviewed a very large one with an awful lot of men and women working there, they said, for example, we love working here because we're not always putting in grant applications. We don't spend all our lives filling in those forms. And I can't read it, but is it 1 minute? I'll finish. We say this is an important piece of research. We get funded. We do the research. We write up the results. We don't have to go through this whole publication process. It's a great place to work. So I urge you, if you have the chance, to read our report. There are a lot of other data that I haven't talked about. There are a lot of sort of case studies. There are examples of how people who do it elsewhere that gets results, because there's a lot more work to be done in this field. And I hope that many of you will be part of doing that work. Thank you.